This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Trophy hunting is big business globally and remains an ongoing controversy. While supporters argue the money helps with conservation efforts, opponents believe it actually exacerbates the decline of wildlife populations. The debate grabbed international headlines when Zimbabwe's iconic Cecil the Lion was killed by a trophy hunter back in 2015. 3 years on, it's thrusted back into the spotlight, with the Trump administration lifting the ban on the importation of big game trophies earlier this year. And Botswana is considering legalizing trophy hunting after having banned it back in 2014. So, does trophy hunting help or hurt wildlife protection? And what's the future of Africa's wildlife conservation? I am Liu Feifei. Welcome to Talk Africa. Trophy hunters pay up to hundreds of thousands of dollars to shoot animals in the wild, some of which are listed as endangered species. Now, while it's argued that the income from trophy hunting supplements critical resources needed for conservation, others believe that the sport intensifies the decimation of iconic species, most of which are found in Africa. Let's take a look at this to understand the extent and impact of Africa's trophy hunting industry.
Trophy hunting is a form of wildlife hunting in which hunters pay for a right to kill animals and take home animal parts as trophies. 11 countries in Africa allow trophy hunting, with South Africa taking the lead. Between 2005 and 2014, animal trophies from South Africa accounted for 32% of the total. In a single year, tourist hunters can kill around 105,000 animals, including around 3,800 buffaloes, 800 leopards, 600 lions, and 640 elephants. Critics say these numbers are unsustainable and damaging to the natural order. But supporters say that the revenue from hunting can reverse the trend of the declining wildlife population. According to a Safari Club International study, more than 18,000 hunters from around the world spend more than $325 million on hunting in Africa annually. The price of a zebra or a giraffe hunt is approximately $8,000. A Cape buffalo brings in $20,000. A leopard hunt can cost as much as $28,000, while a lion hunt can cost $100,000 per cat. Although lions and elephants are marked as vulnerable according to conservation status, that's money that some say is being put to good use. But a recent report by the IUCN disputed that the amount is minuscule in the bigger picture. For example, in Tanzania, income from hunting accounts only for 3% of the tourism industry, whereas in neighboring Kenya, the tourism industry has grown 40 times since hunting was outlawed in 1977. They believe animals can bring more value to Africa's tourism industry, alive than dead.
Now, to help us understand the effects of trophy hunting on the conservation efforts in Africa, we have expert guests standing by. In Johannesburg, we have Dries van Coller. He's the president of the Professional Hunters Association of South Africa. And with me in studio is Dr. Paula Kahumbu. She is the renowned wildlife conservationist and CEO of Wildlife Direct. Thank you both for joining this discussion. Dries, let me begin with you. Do you believe that trophy hunting supports wildlife conservation here in Africa?
Most definitely. I mean, we've got enough evidence to prove that. We've got conservation records for a fair amount of time to indicate that.
How exactly, can you go into some details about how it does that?
Trophy hunting as such has always been a very controversial and sensitive issue. However, if we look at the evidence that it brings in, if I talk out of South Africa's side, is we can see the amount of animals, the increase in animals that were on the verge of extinction that have been brought back from extinction, the increase in populations, the viability of populations, it's definitely contributed. And the main reason being is there's been ownership and the encouragement from hunters to come out and to do the trophy hunting, which enables economy to generate an income.
Dr. Kahumbu, I'm sure you have a response to this. What do you think?
Well, South Africa and many Southern African countries have a very different model to what's happening in Kenya in particular. We don't have trophy hunting. And I would say that there are some really strong cultural reasons why that's the case. In Southern Africa, I think if you were to look at who are the hunters, they are not generally Africans, or definitely not native black Africans. They are generally people from the West. In Kenya, I think that what the local people have said is these animals have been part of our history and we respect them. They even respect and revere wild animals. Many families' names and totems are wild animals. The idea of shooting an animal for pleasure, to have a trophy to hang it on your wall, is just simply abhorrent. And it's not just Kenyans. I think this is a growing concern around the world. Recently we saw images of an American who came to Namibia and shot a family of baboons. It just triggered such enormous emotion from people around the world who have never seen a baboon, and even from people who hate baboons. The idea that you're killing these animals for pleasure, when you look at an animal like a baboon, it's so much like a human being. It makes you realize that what we're doing, maybe there is an ethical concern that needs to be addressed. And what we're seeing worldwide is a decline in interest in hunting, and more people sharing on social media how upset they are with the idea that somebody would come all the way to Africa to shoot an animal that they grew up seeing on National Geographic on television. They grew up loving these animals, and to see them being shot simply for pleasure is kind of sickening.
Dries, to you, what do you think are the ethical considerations involved with trophy hunting? Is it morally correct to kill a big game animal?
Well, I think I just want to make one correction here, is I don't think any hunter is going purely to shoot for pleasure. If we just make the comparisons, and that I've just listened to from my learned friend, is we must take one thing into consideration, is that we are wildlife managers. When we start personifying animals and giving names to animals, it becomes a problem. Now, ethics is a debatable question, and ethics is in the eye of the beholder. Different cultures, different religions, different communities have got different values, and each of these have got a different approach to ethics as such. The comment made that it's purely, it's not indigenous Africans that are involved with hunting, that's not correct. If I just look in our country, and like I said, each country has got the sovereignty to operate how it sees fit. We just see in South Africa the benefits that hunting brings to the communities. The communities are intricately involved with their hunting. So they revere the animals, they look after the animals, because the animals are sustainably utilized to generate a livelihood. So when it comes to ethics as such, it's a debatable question.
Dr. Kahumbu, you want to add to that?
Well, from what we've seen in the scientific literature, the benefits to communities, we're talking about really traditional indigenous African communities, are very limited, very minimal, maybe less than 3% of the revenues being generated from hunting actually goes back to those people. I was in South Africa recently. I do a lot of work with partners in South Africa, and I met a native South African who has recently had land given back to them, and on this land, it was their community's land, there is hunting. And we spoke about the differences, you know, him being a black South African in charge of a community of about 3,000 people on this property. And I told him what we do in Kenya, and he said, you guys have it right. We have now a tradition that we've inherited from other people about how the land should be managed, and it's through hunting, and they buy and sell animals. They will buy an antelope from somewhere, bring it to their property, it'll get shot. And he felt that there was something immoral about it, but they also are stuck because they have enormous bills to pay, and so they're doing something because they have to. And I think that's a shame. If you look at wildlife and the value of wildlife in Africa, isn't it outrageous that we have to kill these beautiful, magnificent animals in order to say that we're saving them? Well, it's not about just people, it's about the animals themselves. We have an entire industry of wildlife filmmaking that has generated billions of dollars. How much of that money ever came back to Africa? We have tourism in Kenya. It's worth $2 billion a year. How much of that money is actually going back into conservation?
Well, that's a good point. Let's pose this question to Dries. What do you think about that? In fact, adding on to what Dr. Kahumbu was saying, the trophy hunting industry here in Africa generates about $200 million US annually, but it only accounts for about 1% of the overall tourism revenues. And according to the Born Free Foundation and other sources, only 3% of that 1% actually goes to sustaining the local communities. And this economic argument is the one that trophy hunters like to put out the most. So Dries, I'd like to give you an opportunity to speak on that.
Each country differs. Now, South Africa's model is an economic model and the viability thereof. We look at the animals where we've taken an animal like the blesbuck, for instance, which was on the verge of extinction. They are in more than abundance now. Black wildebeest, Cape Mountain zebra, just as a few examples. Now, the money that goes back, we have a private ownership model here in South Africa. The land belongs to a private individual. Where in Kenya, it's mostly state-owned land. So the models are different. The communities benefiting in Kenya will be different to South Africa, where in South Africa, the landowner will be the major beneficiary. However, he is creating jobs, he's employing the people, the secondary benefits that come out of that.
Dr. Kahumba, I want to pose this question to you, what your thoughts are about these secondary benefits, such as local employment opportunities, the providing of boreholes in local hospitals, and even animal meat, animal protein. How do you assess these secondary benefits from trophy hunting?
Well, I think Dries, put the hammer on the head, the nail. He said that this is an economic thing. Hunting is an economic model. Hunting is not so much about management. It's the money they get from the hunting that is used for management. The problem is the money. There isn't enough money available in Africa for conservation purposes, which is why we're losing some of our conservation areas. It's not that hunting itself is the management tool. That's where we have to be very clear. If you look at models around the world, look at England, for example. How do they manage their national parks and their national heritage? It's through their national lottery. That's how they raise the money. Go to Canada. They use a tax on corporates in order to finance the management of their national parks. So what we've decided in Africa is different. In South Africa, they've decided that hunting will be one of those tools. In Kenya, we don't do that. In Kenya, there are many other models, and ecotourism
Well, let's talk about the model that you are a proponent of here in Kenya. What is the preferred model for conservation?
Well, in Kenya, we don't own individual animals. There is no hunting whatsoever. There is all kinds of other ways that people can benefit from wildlife. So, for example, I'm involved in filmmaking. That generates revenue for people who own private land and who have wildlife on that property. We also have a very vibrant ecotourism product in Kenya, which is expanding. We now have 160 private and community-owned conservation areas versus 60 government and state-owned. So what Dries said is not true. Most of the land in conservation in Kenya is privately or community-owned, and they are investing their land in conservation because of the benefits they gain. It could be through educational tours, it could be weddings, it could be photography, filmmaking, and of course the traditional ecotourism and adventure tourism. That's what's really growing in this country. Worldwide, tourism is on the rise, so there's no question that this is going to become more and more financially viable as time goes on. And at the same time, what we're seeing is global interest in hunting, especially big game hunting, is actually on its way down. And there are other risks of big game hunting, which we've seen primarily coming out of South Africa. The canned hunting, which is not at all doing an iota of benefit for conservation. It's basically slaughtering animals. It's like having animals in a concentration camp. And then you also have the breeding of animals, which are weird cross mixes that have no business in conservation.
That larger tusks.
Big tusks, big horns, weird crosses of a lion and a tiger, whatever. Funny things that have no conservation value whatsoever.
Let me interrupt you there. Dries, let's go to you. What are your thoughts about that, especially on canned hunting? I think this is quite controversial, even within your Hunters Association. Where do you guys stand on canned hunting, and is that morally right and ethical?
Canned hunting is illegal in our country. There's a perception that when you talk about captive bred animals, that it is canned. We as an association are totally and vehemently opposed to all forms of canned hunting. Our model is a private ownership. The land is owned by an individual. He's entitled to do what he likes on his land. He's paying taxes on those animals. We've proved that we're going from about 500,000 animals in the early 60s and 70s to over 17, 18 million animals now. So, I mean, our conservation success story speaks for itself. Rightly so, it's economically driven, and it's not because of greed, it's a viable option to stimulate an economy.
The amount of permits that are given for big game trophy hunting is quite limited in comparison to the animals that are being decimated regularly from other means, such as poaching. So are we spending too much energy on this topic of trophy hunting, where we should be redirecting our resources to other forms of animal harm?
Oh, absolutely. There is far more animals being killed because of the value of ivory, rhino horn, pangolin scales, and it's not just animals. We're also losing, of course, many of our timber species and corals and other marine life. There's no question that that is where we should be putting our efforts in terms of curtailing international demand, strangling those transit routes, and stemming the poaching in the countries where these animals occur. But I do think that the issue of hunting is a global issue that will remain controversial because of the moral and ethical questions that arise, the way that many people view it as cruel, immoral. It doesn't match with many African value systems.
We'll pick up on that, but now it's time for a short break. When we come back, we'll continue this discussion about the benefits of trophy hunting and the impact that it has on conservation. Stay tuned.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington, and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms, and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue our discussion on the impact of trophy hunting in Africa. Dr. Kahumba, you touched on this before the break, and that the rights and the interests of the local communities. In fact, elephants and rhinos, they come and destroy crops. Lions and leopards, they come and they take the livestock. Is there a collective voice from the communities, and how can we best serve their interests?
I think that the issue of human-wildlife conflict in Kenya and across Africa is probably going to be one of the biggest challenges we have. In some countries, they have simply fenced off private land. So if you own a zebra or a giraffe or an elephant or a rhino, you are responsible for anything that animal does, so you have to fence it in. And that means our wildlife populations get very fragmented. In Kenya, most of our landscapes are still open, and the wildlife can move over large areas, and they can continue with their migrations. But that does create the problem that you're talking about. Human populations are increasing, more people are getting into contact with wildlife, and there is much more damage. The government has been unable to respond effectively, and this is probably the biggest shame that I see in Kenya, is that we are asking communities to love wildlife and protect that wildlife, but we're not compensating them for the damage and the losses that these animals cause to those people's livelihoods. But I don't think it's a lose-lose situation. I'm convinced that we haven't put on our thinking caps. We have so many opportunities. If you look at the sports betting that goes on in Kenya and the billions and billions of shillings that are generated from betting, none of that money goes back into conservation. If we look at the communities that live in these landscapes, they're so poor, they can't afford to even protect themselves. They can't afford to put their children in a car and drive them to school, so their children are walking across landscapes that they're sharing with lions, hyenas, elephants, giraffes, you name it. These are very dangerous animals. We need to think about how do we develop the community and their needs in a way that they are still safe but still living in this matrix of wilderness and developing industries or small towns or villages. I don't think it's impossible. I think it's very possible. We just haven't done it yet.
Dries, what are your thoughts about this? How to empower the local communities and how to best serve their interests?
Well, one of the things is, and there I agree, is we need to take cognizance of the fact the human and wildlife conflict is going to increase. As land gets less, and human populations are growing at astronomical rates, there's going to be more and more competition. What we've seen that works in our country, like I said, is the responsibility with the private landowner. He looks after that. You sit with a challenge. and without compensating the communities and giving a value to them for the losses they suffer. I don't think that they will take the conservation model seriously. A hungry man at the end of the day is going to be very difficult to convince to respect an animal that's causing him harm and damage. So there's a lot of thought that's got to go into the process. We've put a lot of our effort. Like I said, the private ownership model with our ranching, it makes a difference. So you can't compare the two between Kenya and South Africa.
And in fact, what you're describing is in a way playing itself out in Botswana. Botswana, which banned hunting in 2014. Just 4 years later, now earlier this year, the parliament is reconsidering reintroducing trophy hunting. Why is it doing that?
I am at a loss. I actually met with some of the Botswana officials during the illegal wildlife trade conference in London just a week ago. And there were some people in the delegation who were very concerned, very unhappy about this move. They think that it reflects very badly on their nation and the reputation of their country. We know, for example, that lion hunting was banned because of the impact the lion hunting has on lions in general. You know, you take out one big male lion and another lion will move into that pride and kill off all the cubs. And so they were seeing this play out again and again and again, causing major problems. So I'm worried that some countries and some parliaments, some governments, and I'm seeing it even in Kenya in some cases, decisions are made that look like short-term wins based on very simple thinking. There are very few ecologists are invited into the room to help governments make these good decisions. What you have is business-minded people where money speaks. And I think that is the mistake our governments keep making over and over again.
Dries, what do you think is pushing this development in Botswana, and what are your thoughts?
Well, we predicted it would happen quite some time back. And it's exactly that when we said we were wildlife managers. If you don't manage the wildlife populations, you're going to run into these conflicts. Does animal life take precedent over human life? And that's the question we must ask ourselves. Yes, we have got to respect our wildlife and manage it wisely. But there's a lot of things that have got to be taken into consideration. Now, once again, we mentioned earlier on corruption. I firmly believe there's a place for non-consumptive and consumptive tourism in the same areas. But handling corruption is the biggest challenge at hand. And this is the greed that we've got to address. Not the individual safari operator that's hunting a legal quota. It's the illegal operators that are out there. Now, if we look at the Botswana government at this stage, I think we've seen that Botswana sits with a very big elephant population that needs to be managed. And once again, the damage and the remote communities that are getting no benefit from the traditional tourists that would come out. Remember, hunters go to very remote areas. Your normal tourists will not go to these marginal areas. There's nothing that entices them to go there. So we've got to look at the balance between all this. And if there's a balance, then it can be sustainable. Just to get back onto the lion issue, I think we must be careful of putting emotion into it. Yes, there is an element of where a pride male that is hunted will be replaced, and there will be mortalities amongst the cubs as such, but that's a natural occurrence as well. And in well-managed, well-regulated hunting, we see it that it actually benefits conservation. If we look at the restrictions placed on hunting, where the age limitations of above 7-year-old males to be hunted, these are nomadic males that are out of prides, no longer have an influence on that. So there's a lot of science that has gone into this, and there's a lot of science that some respected scientists have put into the research to justify these quotas.
What do you think? Do you agree?
Well, I haven't looked into the specifics that Dries just mentioned about the ages of the males. I think that many countries are not following any biological criteria, and they definitely are not using those criteria when it comes to enforcement. I mean, we saw what happened in Zimbabwe with Cecil. As much as all these nice, beautiful rules are in place and everything is logical, when it came to Cecil, in fact, the guy who hunted Cecil did not get punished for that, what we believe is a crime. I would say something else though. Hunting and values. So what we do here in Kenya, a lot of people are surprised at how much Kenyans love wildlife. You don't hear this very much in other parts of Africa, where Africans will come in their thousands and march on the streets of Nairobi or Mombasa and other cities in support of wildlife protection, in support of better law enforcement, to defend the rights of animals. These are not rich people. These are very young, and forward-thinking Africans who see this as part of their identity. And I go into classrooms and I talk to children, and what I see is that by bringing and reminding our people about our traditional cultural values, we're actually creating a more moral society. Whereas when we just talk about money and the value of money, we start seeing young people going off the rails at a very early age, including cheating and all kinds of things. And when we use wild animals as models of good human values, we see a complete shift. I'm so proud of what we've been able to achieve here in Kenya with millions and millions of children in schools learning about animals and their values and why we should protect them for their own right, not to bring money to me and to put food on my plate, but for their own right. And that having an ecosystem where your animals are safe, your habitat is healthy, where the water is clean, this healthy environment is a part of your wealth.
Prince William, who is the president of United for Wildlife and a patron of the Tusk Trust, and other eminent conservationists such as Amy Dickman, who founded Tanzania's Roha Carnivore Project. They've publicly come out in support of limited commercialized hunting. And they've gone so far as to say that the funds from the hunts are playing a pivotal role in terms of saving animals otherwise endangered. So as the final question to both of you, what role do you think trophy hunting plays in the future of Africa's wildlife conservation? Driss?
Well, from my side, if trophy hunting dies and the bans are placed from the international market, Africa dies. Our rural economies will die. We must not be naive and think they are not dependent on that. We've seen numerous examples where local communities basically are deprived of the income, the facilities, the benefits thereof, and those communities die at the end of the day. So if trophy hunting is done away with, then I see a dismal picture for Africa.
Dr. Kahumbu, you have the final word.
I disagree with that. I think trophy hunting is on its way out. There's no question in my mind that world opinions are changing quite dramatically, especially the more pictures we see. And in fact, Namibia has even banned hunters from showing off their trophies in photographs on social media. That is how powerful those images are in terms of switching off interest in hunting. I think that it's unfortunate that there is this financial element that we do trophy hunting in order to pay so that we can keep animals alive. What we need is the money. We don't need the hunting, we need the money. And we need to be very intelligent about this. We need to be creative. We need to come up with other ways of solving this problem. We've done it in many other areas. There's no money to be gained in solving Ebola, and yet billions of dollars goes into that kind of a problem. We should be doing the same about saving the world's biodiversity, and that includes everything from elephants down to the tiniest little creatures. Hunting is purely about just a handful of animals. Let's be realistic about saving the natural ecosystems in their entirety and making sure that the people who are living in those landscapes and the people who are responsible for those landscapes are enabled to do so. They shouldn't be forced to choose between absolute destruction of these landscapes or hunting. They should have other options. And so I think we need to be much more creative about it.
And on that note, that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our panel of experts, starting with Driss van Coller in Johannesburg, who is the president of the Professional Hunters Association of South Africa. And with me in the studio, Dr. Paula Kahumbu, a wildlife conservationist and CEO of Wildlife Direct. Remember, you can be a part of the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do join us again next week for more of Talk Africa. I am Liu Feifei. From me and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, goodbye.